Good to go.
All right, very good. Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Happy Monday morning. For those I haven't met, my name is Kate Fritz, and I have the honor of serving as the CEO of the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay. I'm here at the beautiful Annapolis Maritime Museum and Park with the amazing Executive Director and CEO, Alice Estrada, here joining us. Thanks, Alice, for hosting us this morning.
It's absolutely my pleasure to host the Chesapeake Bay Alliance. We have total mission overlap and it's altogether fitting.
Absolutely. So this is the second of our Breakfast on the Bay series. We kicked this off last week with a native plant talk that is recorded and available on our website. But today we're talking about the history of the health of the Chesapeake Bay. And I can think of no better place to be than the Annapolis Maritime Museum, whose mission truly is to educate about the Chesapeake Bay and the maritime history. So Alice, if you want to just spend a couple minutes, just tell us about the Maritime Museum and Park and what you all do here.
Sure. Well, for starters, we're sitting in the last operating oyster packing plant in Annapolis, McNasby's, hence the sign behind us. We just recently transformed this building with new exhibits that are very, very exciting. In fact, there's a whole section on oyster health. But we also talk about the working waterfront and the Annapolis waters. This is getting rave reviews. We have brand new exhibits. Please come join us for those. We are really, really pleased with how that turned out in a relatively small space. There's a lot of information and it's very well presented. High tech, high touch. Yeah. In addition, we have a park that's really literally across the creek here, the back creek that is. We can see the water tower, and that's sort of our landmark. That park we we acquired in 2016 from the city of Annapolis. It's known to many of you as the Ellen O. Moyer Nature Park. It's 12 acres on the water, and it was decrepit. So we took that over and have really transformed it into our education center. And for those of you who don't know, we run a robust education program, again, teaching about environmental literacy, teaching them to be bay stewards, but also their local maritime history. So about 12,000 students a year on a non-COVID year, a non-pandemic year. In fact, our summer camp launches today, and that sold out in a New York minute. I think people were so eager to get kids outdoors, and our whole premise and objective is to connect kids to nature in the bay. So, and I do want to mention, if I could, staring at it right here, fortunately, it's not the backdrop, but our 75-foot skipjack Wilma Lee. And she is the epitome of preserving maritime history. She's from 1940. We acquired her in 2018 and spent almost 2 years restoring her. She is open for public sales right now. You can do a heritage tour. You can do a sunset sail. You can do a Wednesday night race experience and just go out there and see the races. So we're really proud of her. She's one of only 22 skipjacks sailing left
in the whole Chesapeake Bay.
In the whole Chesapeake Bay region. So we are really excited about her. She's the only one in Annapolis. So please come experience that, and all that information, visiting the museum, learning about our education programs, sailing on Wilma Lee, and or if you'd like to rent this beautiful venue, it's an important source of income. We do have weddings here. Can I just mention Kate got married here? So It's a very authentic Annapolis experience. All that information can be found on our website, amaritime.org.
Very good. Well, thank you, Alice. Thanks again for hosting us here. We really appreciate it. So we're going to dive into our talk with Dr. Boynton in a minute here, but the Maritime Museum has a great video that we're going to show first called Our Changing Waterfront. And it gives a really great view of the work that you're doing here, the Maritime Museum and the park, but also about the Chesapeake Bay and the history and kind of a bigger picture that'll help lead us into our discussion around water.
I think so. And you'll be, if you're not an Annapolitan, you'll want to live here after watching this film.
There we go. Very good. Awesome. So without further ado, Lauren, if you could tee up the video for us.
The Chesapeake Bay, a critical part of American infrastructure, an abundant fishery and beloved playground, a national treasure under threat. The Bay is all of these things and more. The Chesapeake Bay is the largest estuary in the United States, being a partially enclosed body of brackish water fed by 150 fresh rivers and streams, like the Susquehanna River in the north, with an open connection to the salt water of the Atlantic Ocean in the south. Water from 6 states flows into the bay, and its tidal shoreline is more than 11,000 miles long. This is one big body of water, and we are here to help you make your own connection.
Welcome to Annapolis, Eastport, and the Annapolis Maritime Museum and Park. Since 2000, our campuses have provided rare public access to the Chesapeake Bay. We host school trips and summer camps, while our environmental education programs serve more than 15,000 students annually. We provide a variety of public programs from concerts to lectures. We run on-the-water programs aboard our historic 75-foot skipjack, Loma Lee, as well as tours to the iconic Thomas Point Shoal Lighthouse. Our second 12-acre park campus boasts walking trails, paddleboarding, and kayak rentals. Thank you for joining us today.
The very word Chesapeake originated with the Native Americans of this region, the Susquehannock, Powhatan, Croatan, and the Nanticoke. We now believe it meant big water. For centuries, the bay helped Annapolis become a center of the American story. All 4 Maryland signers of the Declaration of Independence kept homes here. The city was briefly the capital of the United States, and today serves as the capital of Maryland. For generations, it has helped train the next leaders of the Navy and Marine Corps, and has been home to a vibrant marine industry, including boat builders, sailors, and commercial watermen.
The persons around here that makes a living off of the water is considered a waterman, a term unique to the Chesapeake Bay. A waterman adapts to the seasons. We oyster, we crab, and we fish.
The bay supports a vibrant ecosystem in which both freshwater and saltwater creatures coexist. In the early 20th century, watermen took advantage of the bay to turn it into the most productive protein factory on the planet by harvesting the easily accessible, abundant, and coveted oyster. A multitude of oyster boats were built, and more than a dozen oyster processing facilities hired workers, including the McNasbys, which opened their doors in Eastport in 1918. Today, the McNasby Building is a centerpiece of the Annapolis Maritime Museum's campus and is where you stand right now.
The McNasby's was a busy place. We had women, men, black and white, to shuck and pack oysters to be distributed. The oyster business got so big that Maryland had to create an oyster navy. The disease, the demand, the overharvesting wiped out 99% of the oyster population.
As the ecosystem of the bay shifted, scientists and researchers discovered the connection between the oysters and a healthy Chesapeake Bay. Since a single oyster can filter up to 50 gallons of water in a single day. A number of public and private efforts are currently underway to reinvigorate the bay's oyster population. Wild oysters are still harvested, but farm-raising programs called aquaculture raise them in quantity year-round. Over the 3 centuries since its founding, Annapolis has evolved from a colonial trading port to a base for commercial watermen, and to a playground of commercial marinas, power boats, sailing schools, and major events. It is common to see international regattas, fishing tournaments, boat shows, and local traditions right here in Annapolis throughout the year. Annapolis, Maryland is at the heart of Chesapeake country. The beauty, history, and ecosystem of the big water is a part of all of our lives, even if we live many miles away from its shoreline. You can do your part to keep the bay healthy by supporting the Annapolis Maritime Museum. We are committed to educating youth, the next generation, about the bay's delicate ecosystem and our role in restoring and sustaining its balance. We motor, paddle, and sail across it. We measure years passing in sunrises and sunsets over its waters. We feel this connection to the Chesapeake Bay and hope you do too. Let's work together to preserve this special place. Welcome to Annapolis, Eastport, and the Annapolis Maritime Museum and Park.
Thank you, Lauren. Lauren, it seems that my video has been disabled. If you could turn that on for me, that would be great. Well, thanks everybody again for joining us. Those that are just joining us on Facebook, we're here at the Annapolis Maritime Museum celebrating a new lecture series that we're rolling out called Breakfast on the Bay. And we're here, we're going to talk about the health and history of the Chesapeake Bay with Dr. Walter Boynton in a minute here. But before we get started, I want to talk a little bit about the Alliance and the work that we do. So for 50 years, since 1971, the Alliance has brought together communities, companies, and conservationists to restore the lands and waters of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. We do that in 4 different program areas, including green infrastructure, forest work, agriculture, and stewardship and engagement. We work all across the entirety of the Chesapeake Bay, which is a 64,000 square mile watershed, with our headquarters in Annapolis, an office in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Washington, D.C., and Richmond, Virginia. So we've been doing our work for 50 years. We've certainly seen a lot of changes in the Chesapeake Bay in 50 years, and that really is the point of our lecture here today. And I'm so excited to be joined with Dr. Walter Boynton, who I've had the privilege of knowing for many years, knowing his family for many years. I see your daughter Sarah's on, so they're keeping tabs on you today, Walter.
Exactly. I need to be watched.
There you go. Very good. Walter is a retired professor from University of Maryland who's been helping study the health of the Chesapeake Bay. He's really specialized in areas around eutrophication, which is a fancy word for too many nutrients, huh?
Got it.
Yep.
Perfect.
So we're gonna hand the reins over to Walt to give us a perspective of the Chesapeake Bay. So Walt, if you want to introduce yourself before we get started on your slides, that would be great.
Sure. Well, I'm Walt Boynton. I'm an ecologist, estuarine ecologist. And just to make more sense, it's really, I'm a general practitioner when it comes to ecology. I'm not a specialist. I'm interested in what's happening to these whole systems. And we've been doing this for a long time. And I'm part of I was, and I still am to a certain extent, part of a big research group that's working on these issues. So that's the background. And I've been here, I came to the Bay Area in 1969, and I've been, more or less, except for graduate school, I've been here ever since. So it's been a great ride.
That's great.
Really fascinating.
So you have seen the changes firsthand.
Many of them, yes, both for the good and the bad.
Yeah.
So it's in recent years, the exciting thing and the real heartening thing is to see the Bay responding to the things that are being done to reduce the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment getting into the Bay. So, I mean, this is Alliance stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, they're part of the solution. As hundreds of agencies, and, just thousands of people doing the right thing, and the Bay's responding. So that's great.
Excellent.
Yeah, it's nice to be part of a success story.
That's right. Exactly.
Yeah.
There's something to be hopeful about.
Yep.
Keep us getting out of bed in the morning, right?
Exactly.
Very good. Awesome. Well, without further ado, why don't we tee up your presentation?
Yeah.
I think Lauren's going to screen share for us. Right. You want to go to the next slide there, Lauren, and get us started?
Yeah, this is, we're going to show you a few history slides here. And this is one of my all-time favorite slides. It was painted in 1588. And the interesting part of it is the artist painted the bottom of the bay, which means that's where the biological action was. The water was gin clear. And so to some extent, this giant restoration process that we're undergoing right now is to move the bay from what it is now, which tends to be more of a water column system, back to what it was, which was oriented towards the bottom. That's where the action was. So we're looking for a clearer system, a system with more seagrasses and more of the creatures that occupy the bottom of the. Next one, Lauren. Yeah, this is one of my favorite slides. And this is also to entertain ourselves a little bit. These are from a book put together by a historian. And the top statement says that they traded with the natives for corn, venison, fish, oysters, nuts, beans, all kinds of food. And they also traded swords for turkeys. And that probably was not a good deal for the English settlers back in the early 1600s. But it sends the message that when the Europeans first showed up here, they were not adapted to the Chesapeake, which was literally an area that produced an enormous amount of food. They had trouble getting to it. The second one I like has to do with tobacco, which was a big feature of the colonial Chesapeake. And it says that tobacco, it purges the superfluous phlegm and other gross humors and opens all the pores and passages of the body. And that was a statement by a guy named Harriet, who died of a nasal tumor in 1621. So for 400 years, we've been running these tobacco wars, and they're still with us. And the last one has to do with the starving time, which was during 1609, 1610. That was a tough time, and the people who survived were eating literally anything they could get their hands on. It was a tough time indeed. Okay, Lauren. And so what we've got here is a bit of scientific and political history. And I should say at the outset, this is according to Walter. Not everybody would put the things I have on this list, but I think they're important, and it gives us some perspective about just how long a process this restoration business has been. And so during the 50s and 60s, the general scientific understanding was that pollution was not a possibility in estuaries because they were flushed. They were cleaned up by the seawater coming from the ocean with the tides. So you can think of, in a way of flushing your toilet at home. Clean water shows up because there's this flushing mechanism. So that's literally the thinking in the 1950s and early 60s. And politically in the 1960s, there was nothing, and we mean absolutely nothing wrong with the Chesapeake Bay. Reports of pollution are false and unpatriotic. You can be fired for this sort of loose talk. And some people at the University of Maryland came close to being fired because they started to see some alarming trends in the Bay, and they had the courage to report it. In the 60s and 70s, the idea was, supported by some of the state agencies, that the more nutrients we can pour into the bay, the more nitrogen and phosphorus we put in the bay, the better. Farmers know that fertilization is important, so let's get on with fertilizing the bay. And then in the 70s and 80s, we got to the point where, okay, estuaries can be polluted. That's 20 years after the original idea about it not being possible to pollute the bay. The only thing needed for restoration was to control phosphorus, which was the early idea of restoration success. And then in the 80s and 90s, we realized that both nitrogen and phosphorus were killing bay habitats. The bay was a term we use a lot now, nutrient obese. People can get with that. They understand obesity, too much of a good thing. And the bay needed a nutrient diet, and it needed it badly. And in the recent decades, we have learned that restoration is hard, it's expensive. Fears that all aspects of the bay had really long memories proved to be false. In other words, the bay was responsive, and that's really good news. And we've also learned that there are surprises along this restoration pathway. So that's my view of 60 years of restoration science and politics with regards to the bay. And I think we're on the right track and we're moving along very nicely. This is this is good news right now.
You're share some of that with us in a little bit.
Oh, yes, indeed.
I'm excited to hear that.
You know, there are a couple of bay features that I really like to tell people about, you know, and the first one is that we're all connected to the bay, no matter where we live. We don't have to live on the waterfront to be connected. So the example I like is that if I drop some nitrogen, for example, at the very head of the Susquehanna River in Cooperstown, where the Baseball Hall of Fame is located, that's 400 miles from the bay. If I drop that nitrogen in the bay at Cooperstown in March or April, when the rivers are flowing strongly, that nitrogen's in the bay 4 days later. 4 days,
Wow.
not 4 weeks, not 4 months, not 4 years, 4 days. And there, if we added up all of the streams in the basin, end to end, they would go halfway to the moon.
Wow.
So the idea that we're not connected to the bay is just wrong. We are all connected. And that's something that the Alliance realizes, and they act upon that, which is really great. So Lauren, the next one, we're connected via these rivers and streams. The other one is a double-edged sword, and that is that the bay has a long water residence time. So let me give you a quick example. Our friends in Boston, Massachusetts, okay, they have an estuary there, Boston Harbor. They also have 12-foot tides. And so that water in Massachusetts Bay is exchanged in a few days. If I took and could magically turn all the water in Chesapeake Bay red, and I asked the question, okay, how long would it take for all of those red water molecules to go away? The answer would be 4 to 6 months. So the bay is retentive. And that's one of the reasons why it is so terribly productive, is that it's retentive. You don't flush the goodies to the ocean right away. They hang around. On the other hand, that's why we need to be careful, because we don't flush the baddies to the ocean right away either. They hang around. So that's an important feature of Chesapeake Bay. And the message to all of us, I think, is we need to be careful.
Yeah.
You know, engineers like me, even environmental engineers, they have lots of rules of thumb. And one of the rules of thumb is that dilution can be the solution to pollution. And that is a really bad idea in the Chesapeake. Good idea in some other places, but not here. Okay, Lauren.
Great. I think we just covered that slide, but so Lauren, if you just want to unshare for a minute. Thank you. I'll just remind all of our viewers, if you have any questions for Dr. Boynton or myself, please put them in the chat. We'll be happy to answer them. So that was, you just gave us a great history of where we've come from in the Chesapeake Bay and some of the big, overarching challenges we have in the Bay. And then you're gonna go into kind of touching on two keystone species, two important indicators about the health of the Bay.
That's right. Seagrasses, certainly one of them.
Mhm.
So that's the plant part.
Right.
And oysters, that's the animal part.
Right.
Both of them.
Yeah.
Keystone features of the bay. That's a great word for that.
Yep. Absolutely. So let me see if we have any questions before we start our presentation back up here. All right. I don't see any quite yet. So Lauren, if you want to head back to the PowerPoint for us, we'll continue on to talk about submerged vegetation and oysters.
This is actually a slide from the last time, but it's fine. A lot of people have asked the science community, and they certainly have asked me, so how much has the nitrogen input to the bay increased? And for many years, we did not have a very crisp answer, but we do now. And it looks like from the John Smith days to the current time, the increase is by about a set factor of 6, not 600, not 60. It's about a factor of 6. And what we found is that during the 1960s, the early 1960s, the bay apparently was probably at its productive peak. In other words, there was enough nitrogen and phosphorus to run as one of the Baltimore newspaper people called it a great protein factory, probably at its peak. And since then, we've gone into the nutrient obese range. So what we want to do, and what this restoration is all about, is basically cutting the nutrient load in half. And we're about halfway to cutting it in half, which is great. We've got a long way to go. And some of the future reductions are going to be the more difficult kinds. But the Bay is already responding. So that's good news.
Great.
Let's go to the SAB stuff.
Next slide.
Yeah, so we've got a bunch of species in the Bay. They range from freshwater to strictly marine. The history here is that at one point estimates that there were 300,000 acres of seagrass in the Bay. So in your mind's eye, seagrasses were like a green reef all around the shorelines of the Bay. 13 different species at least. And they were a buffer. They were also a kidney that operated between the land and the open waters of the Bay. So, next one. This is one of my favorite photographs. This is Solomon's Island, where I've worked for many years, but it was shot in May of 1933. And one of the messages here was that the water was thin clear. All of that dark area along the shoreline, that's seagrass. And those seagrasses in the Patuxent went from Solomon's at the mouth of the Patuxent for 40 miles up the river, changing species to the freshwater species as we got farther up the river. When I first saw this photograph, I wasn't even sure where the shoreline was because the water is so clear. So 1933, let's jump ahead a couple of decades. 1963, the seagrasses in the Patuxent were starting to break up. Also, the basin was starting to develop. The nutrient loads started to increase. In Grace Brush, who was a paleoecologist working at Johns Hopkins, called me up one day, and they had finished looking at some sediment pores. And as they looked down those pores, they were looking back in time. And what Grace had to say was, did the seagrasses disappear about 1970? And I said, yeah, they did in the Patuxent. And she said, well, you should know that prior to 1970, seagrasses were always present in the Patuxent for the previous 1,200 years. So we know something about the history of these grasses.
Yeah. Wow.
So that's a long, long time series. Okay. Oysters. Okay, we've got a few interesting slides here. And they also are a keystone species. Certainly were past. Some of these beds were so abundant. The oyster reefs were so big that early colonial people thought of them as hazards to navigation. Should be so lucky again today.
Yeah. I've heard that they were 3D beds that almost stuck out of the water.
Yes, absolutely. They were huge.
Wow.
So they were a kidney. We saw in the video clip before, oysters filtering 50 gallons of water per oyster per day. All of that's largely true. I mean, and one of the things we need to remember is that oysters were about one part of the filtering community. We have clams in the Bay also that can be filterers. My first day as a marine scientist, they took me over to the Potomac River, and we were working on a clam project over there. And I was along just to, help sort and do whatever I was told. Anyway, in this experimental test area, which was a little larger than this pier that we're sitting on here, we scooped up 44 bushels of soft clams. So the filtering capacity of the Bay was monstrous. And that's one of the things we want to get back is that kidney effect. Okay, Lauren. So during the 1880s, that was when the oyster industry really went wild. There were something like 26,000 people involved in the fishery, almost over 4,000 boats involved. And they were selling oysters for 7 cents a bushel.
Wow, a bushel.
Yeah, a bushel, 7 cents. And estimates are that there were over 400 million pounds of oyster meat in the oyster stock that was in the Bay. And currently, in at least 2007, the estimate was that there's something like 4 million. So that was 1% of the previous big 1880 stock. Okay, Lauren, so the kidney has been seriously removed. This is some oyster reef specters. These guys do not look like they're telling each other jokes.
No,
And
very serious.
yeah, you're not kidding. A serious crowd for sure. All right, Lauren. And some statements about the oyster industry, the early industry. That oysters were fine and cheap, and they were eaten daily by all classes. Rich people, poor people, everybody ate oysters. And when I first got here in the late 60s, oysters were still, we thought of them as a food. Now we think of them as an hors d'oeuvre.
And a delicacy.
A
certainly,
delicacy, yeah. And what we really need to do is hopefully move it back to food. And the expansion of aquaculture is certainly helping us. The legislatures of Maryland and Virginia have always been content to work in the dark regarding oyster management. And that, might aggravate some people, but the historical record is pretty clear. Yes, that's what they did. And in fact, the first true stock assessment of oysters took place just a few years ago.
Wow.
Yeah. And so now we have an oyster management plan, we have a stock assessment. So we're moving, I think, in the right direction. And this is the one I like. Dredging in Maryland is carried on by 5,600 daring and unscrupulous men, okay, who regard the laws of God or man. In other words, these were some pretty tough characters.
Yeah.
Working on a skip deck during the winter time was no fun. So we have, in some ways, this romantic picture of what the fishery was, but it was actually pretty tough.
Yeah.
One of my brothers was a commercial fisherman in the North Atlantic.
Oh my gosh.
And I went with him on some winter trips. So I've never been on a skipjack in the winter, but I've been on a fishing boat in New England. And any romance was pretty hard to find. Mainly, it was stay alive and stay warm.
I bet, yeah.
So, Lauren, next one. This is an incredible photograph. This is from Hampton, Virginia, and that's a pile of oyster shells, 200,000 bushels. So, in some ways, the sort of the unregulated fishery of the late 1800s, early 1900s was actually estuarine search. We were removing the kidney, one of the kidneys of the bay, and it happened pretty quickly over the course of 2 or 3 decades. It was amazing. I've heard some people talk about that period of time where the oyster fishery was not a fishery, but it was actually a mining operation where we were moving the reefs, flattening the bay bottom. So a time of intensive change.
Can you talk about why it's problematic that all the shell has been removed?
Yeah. I mean, that's an issue in and of itself. The oyster life cycle requires some kind of hard substrate. So the larvae, the tiny baby oysters, when they metamorphosize and they are ready to set on something and become permanently attached, they like to attach to oyster shell. They'll attach to other things as well, but there's a limited supply of shell and a limited supply of clean shell because these little characters are a little particular. They like clean shell or clean rock to set on. So that's a challenge right there.
Yeah.
In some of the restoration work that's being done. And by the way, I mean the restoration work on oyster beds that are being done, those are the biggest efforts in the world.
Wow.
So this is spectacular.
Yeah.
Trying to reinsert a kidney into the bay ecosystem. Okay. So
we're on to good news.
yeah, we're on to good news.
All right.
And there's a bunch of it. I should preface it by saying that this good news, which has been occurring since about 1990, is occurring in the face of population growth in the basin. So there are millions of more people living here, changing the landscape than when we first started this restoration work. So it's amazing that we've been making this kind of progress.
We have about 18 million people in the Chesapeake now, I believe,
That's
right?
correct.
And I think I saw projections to get like another 1.5 million in the next 10 years or so.
Yes.
So really
So we need to
continue
be-
to add people.
Exactly. We need to be particularly smart. a friend of mine who was a poet and a songwriter, a fellow named Tom Wisner.
I remember.
He's passed away about 10 years ago. But in one of his songs, he talked about the efforts to clean up the bay, and he likened it to walking north on a fast-moving southbound train. In other words, we need to work extra hard because we're changing the landscape in ways that tend to promote nitrogen, phosphorus, dirt, and other things getting into the bay. So we need to be particularly aggressive. We need to be very smart to make this work. And the evidence is that to some extent, we've been doing that.
Yeah.
So the good news, the nutrient loads are going down. That is nitrogen and phosphorus. The amount getting into the bay is going down. They've gone down by about 26, 27%. That's incredible. The bay is getting clearer, not everywhere and not all the time, but that's the trend. Seagrasses are bounding. That's one of the kidneys, and that is really, really important. The dead zones are decreasing in both size and duration. That is.
Can you define what a dead zone is?
Yeah,
for
it's a
our
place
viewers?
where there's either very limited amount of oxygen in the water or no oxygen at all. So we have dead zones right out here off Annapolis, in the Potomac, in the Tucson, in most of the major rivers. There are places where we've got serious oxygen problems. The good news is they're getting smaller and not lasting as long, which is excellent news. And there's some indication that the bay has its own self-cleaning processes, and they are starting to kick in, particularly with regards to seagrasses and the oxygen issues. So a little oxygen in the bay will promote more oxygen in the bay. Some seagrasses promote more seagrasses. And these are the kind of, technically, we call them non-linear responses. What it really is the bay is better enough so it can help itself get better.
That's great.
And those are really important. So
great.
you want to take a look at a few?
Yeah, let's see more of this good news. Next slide. There we go.
Yes, one of them is things we call point sources. Discharges from sewage treatment plants. They are going down. The top figure there is for Blue Plains. That serves part of the metropolitan Washington area. It is the biggest advanced wastewater treatment plant in the world. In the world.
That's amazing. Right here in our Chesapeake Bay.
Right, exactly. And the environmental engineering that they're doing there, and at the graph below it, that's a big plant in Baltimore. It's absolutely amazing. They are reducing the outputs from those plants in very, very powerful ways. So in Maryland, years ago, we passed something that's commonly called the flush tax.
Right.
Okay, and my point of view is that we need those kind of financial streams to fund the things that we know we need to do. And Maryland has currently upgraded all 63 of their major storage treatment plants. That's a wonderful.
That's great news. For
Yes, exactly. Next one. One of these things that was not part of the bay restoration thinking in the early years. We literally didn't realize that nitrogen fell out of the sky in significant quantities. Fact is, it does.
Yeah.
So what I'm showing here is an original, that's the top figure, amount of atmospheric nitrogen falling on the eastern United States. It was very red. There was a lot of it. The bottom figure shows with much less red what it is a few years ago. So what's happened here is that the Clean Air Act started insisting that electric generating facilities clean up their smokestacks, and they did.
Wow.
And you can see that atmospheric deposition has been cut by about a half, which is terrific. That's another major achievement. And really, it's the Clean Air Act helping the Clean Water Act.
Yeah.
And that's the way things ought to work.
Yeah, and it's the Ohio Valley that is actually impacting the
That's right.
Chesapeake Bay.
Yes, the airshed of the Chesapeake is about 7 times bigger than the watershed.
Wow.
So that's something that's become clear, and this is good news.
That is great news.
Yes, it is indeed. Go ahead.
Next slide, Lauren.
So there are hints that the water clarity is improving. Go ahead, Lauren.
Yep, keep going. I think.
Keep going,
there-
yes.
There we go.
And so we've got some trends here that for many years was a slight downward trend, water becoming more turbid. And go ahead, and more recently, we're starting to see some clarity coming back. And we're starting to see these kind of seagrass meadows. And this is a really important one. It's up in Susquehanna Flats, right at the head of the bay. And in about 1998, there were literally a few springs there. We went into a drought period in 1999, 2000, 2001, and 2002, which was a natural experiment. The amount of nitrogen and phosphorus went down a lot.
Wow.
And what happened? This bed went from almost nothing, 14,000 acres
Wow.
of seagrasses, big enough so that it, during the summertime, actually starts treating the water coming down the Susquehanna River. So this is one of those feedbacks I was talking
Yeah.
about earlier. This is the kind of thing we really want to see more generally in the Bay Area. So this is a powerful experimental almost result of decreasing the amount of nitrogen and phosphorus getting into the bed. So this nitrogen and phosphorus stuff, I mean, it is absolutely essential for the life of the bay.
Yeah.
In fact, life in general.
Yes, life in general, right?
But too much of it leads to this nutrient obesity issue. And we're just trying to move that essential ingredients, nitrogen and phosphorus, back into a range that's literally healthy.
Yeah.
So
We're
that's
gonna
what-
go on a bit of a diet here in the Chesapeake,
Exactly.
right? That's what
Major
we're on.
diet.
Yeah, good. Well, that's great. So Lauren, if you can share the screen there, that would be great. I think that's our last slide.
yes.
And I think we have a couple questions coming in.
Yes, there are a few questions.
You want to, okay.
You want me to read them to you?
Is the first one, do we still have 13 species of seagrass in the Chesapeake Bay?
Yeah. And, you know, if I was a botanist and I'm not, I would probably be up here blithering on for hours about whether it's 12 or 14.
Right.
But yeah, we do. And some of them are strictly marine, like eelgrass. Some of them are mid-salinities, like the redhead grass. And some of them are absolutely cannot stand much salt at all, the freshwater species. And then there's quite a few of those.
And we have quite a few invasive species coming
We
in.
do have,
Right.
yes, the Eurasian water milfoil is one. Hydrilla was one. And when Hydrilla first showed up here, the Washington Post had some cartoons of the Hydrilla monster taking over the whole Chesapeake Bay. And what we found, the USGS, US Geological Survey, done some wonderful work on the Potomac River. And what they found was that when Hydrilla came in, it actually improved water quality enough so that the native species started coming back here.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and so they found that there was a relatively delicate, almost an off-on switch. If water clarity got to be just good enough, the natives came in, and Hydrilla apparently made that possible.
Interesting.
So as the water clarity has continued to increase, the natives have become more and more dominant. So that's good news.
That is good news.
It's
Interesting.
yeah. So that particular invasive was, in a sense, not all bad.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Let's see what other questions we have here. Where can we find more information about Tom Wisner's life and work?
Boy, yes. There is. Oh boy. I need to send you some information to put that on your webpage.
Okay.
There is a nonprofit that handles that, and I don't want to give people the wrong information.
So you send me information and we'll make sure we'll get that to
Yes,
our
right.
attendees today. Okay.
He has a number of albums that are still available. There is a songbook that he was putting together when he passed away, and several people, Frank Schwartz, Teresa Whitaker, and others, got that into print. And it's really for kids in elementary school.
Oh,
It's really designed for. It's really a cool song.
yeah.
So
I got
there's
the
that.
I got the privilege to see Tom Wisner when I was at St. Mary's College of Maryland. So I special connection to him as well. So I know he has a very special connection to your family.
Yes.
Yes, that's great. We'll share that information, certainly. Let's see what else we have. Challenging here in the light.
I can read them to you, Kate.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Lauren.
I said I can read them to you.
Okay, that'd be great.
Yeah, the next question is, what do you think, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, what do you think we should do about the buildup of silt behind the Conowingo Dam?
What should we do about the buildup of the silt behind the Conowingo Dam?
Yes.
That's a big question.
Yes. And I should say at the beginning, there are a number of points of view on that. One point of view is that, and this is underway, there is some experimental work being done to try to remove it and find a productive use for that dirt. My point of view, and the point of view of some others, is that the big effort ought to go into keeping the dirt on the land in the Susquehanna River Valley. That's the biggest issue, as opposed to trying to bail some dirt out of this reservoir. And part of the reason, well, there are two reasons I favor that. One is that it looks like the reservoir system there basically transports the dissolved nutrients, which are really the ones that cause water quality problems in the bay. They just go right through those reservoirs and always have, no change there. The other thing is that there has been a terrific change since the 1930s in the amount of dirt coming off the landscape in Pennsylvania. And back in the 1930s, and I'll use rough numbers here, there was something like 10 units of dirt coming off that landscape. The reservoirs trapped 9. 1 went to the bay. Now, okay, I'm jumping ahead many decades, there's 1 unit coming off the landscape, and there's 1 unit being transported to the bay. So the net differences are not huge. We also need to remember that this is a coastal plain estuary. Dirt is not a foreign substance here. Like nutrients, too much of it is not good. Okay, but this estuary has been used to dirt for a long time. Another thing that many people don't realize is that about half of the sediment that gets into the bay comes from shoreline erosion. Okay, and that came as a big surprise to me. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers did a definitive piece of on that, and that was one of the important conclusions.
Yeah.
And that stood the test of time so far.
Yeah.
So focus on the landscape in the Susquehanna River Basin. I think that would be, if I had a magic wand and I had one wish for bay restoration, I would wish that they could cut those loads in half.
All right.
And that would be terrific.
Good preventative on the land before it even gets into our water.
Yeah, exactly.
All right,
Yeah.
that's good. That's what the Alliance, we were just talking about this earlier, the Alliance does so much tree planting work and work on farms in the Susquehanna Basin because it, almost half of the fresh water to Chesapeake Bay comes from
That one
New
day.
York and Pennsylvania. So,
And
significant.
one of the things about the Susquehanna is it does not wander through a lot of wetlands like many of our other tributary systems do, like the James, for instance, New York, Rappahannock, the Tucson, the Choptank, the Chester. And we know that as that water comes off the landscape and goes through all those wetlands, the sediment and nutrient loads decline.
Mm.
The Susquehanna just kind of jets right into the bay.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Different morphology of the rivers,
Exactly.
right? Yeah,
Yep.
interesting. More challenging to manage.
It does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
We have a few questions. Sorry, we have a few questions around what are the 3 to 4 most important things we need to do to keep the progress going? And specifically, this is 2 questions. One is sort of watershed wide, and then the other one is about Maryland residents specifically.
So the question is, what are the top 3 to 4 things we need to do to keep the progress?
Correct. Yep.
Thoughts on that?
I do.
I know you do. You've been doing a lot of thinking about it, yeah.
Yeah. I would say one of the things that, people listening to this presentation, as if they're listening to me, but maybe they are. Anyway, in any case, I'd say one of the things you can do is to join your local river keeper organization. Okay, you could join the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay. Those are our folks that are working on a daily basis to achieve some of the things we're trying to get in this restoration work. Those are important things that you can do. A second thing you can do, and this can be either very local or regional, is to volunteer and help out on tree planting activities. That's for sure. You can show up on the environmental day in Annapolis. Have your voice heard. I've been to a bunch of them. There are annual events. I'm not sure they'll have it in person this year.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's virtual this year, but yeah, we'll see what the next year brings.
They are heartening events. I mean, the giant environmental community gets together, and there are people that are even older than me and far younger, and I find it encouraging. That's something you can do on your own yard. You can stop putting fertilizer on your grass. Just don't do it. You can plant trees. You can plant native shrubs. My wife on our little bit of property has been going nuts after stilt grass and any other invasive and planting native plants. She's a terror about that, and I'm glad that she is.
Yeah.
So those are some of the things you can do.
Yep.
You can also go to the website for the conservation voters and look to see what your senator and delegate is doing. And you can vote accordingly. So that's another deal. You can absolutely look at.
Yep.
So those are a few things.
Yeah, I'll add in, some simple things that you can do in your everyday life. You can switch to using reusable water bottles instead of plastic water bottles. Plastic pollution is so pervasive. Microplastics are a modern problem that, all those wastewater treatment plants you just talked about being upgraded, they're now going to have to figure out how do we filter microplastics. So switching to a reusable water bottle is an easy way to reduce plastic. Bringing your own grocery bag to the store is another way to reduce plastic. So there are things you can do in your everyday life. Picking up after your dog, and properly disposing of dog waste. You'd mentioned not fertilizing your lawn right before it rains. If you go to allianceforthebay.org, we've got lots of tips that you can utilize in your own life to help Chesapeake Bay. Lauren, we have another question.
Yeah, we have a few more. Do residents along the Chesapeake Bay have to plant riparian zones?
I think it depends. If you are, and I'll speak to Maryland, if you live within 1,000 feet of mean high tide, that's called the critical area. And there is a special set of legislation and policies related to what can and cannot be done within that 1,000 feet of mean high tide in the critical area. There are other communities and other laws around the different states that either require certain types of lengths of buffers from stream, whether it's 25 foot, 50 feet, 100 feet in some case. So it's really dependent on the jurisdiction in which the property is in terms of requirements for planting buffers. You have anything to add to that?
No, that's good. Yeah.
Hopefully that answers that question. I'm happy to help anybody point them in the right direction if they have more specific questions after this.
Great. We have another question here about, can you talk about how the Bay responded to the drought we had a number of years ago? I recall the Magathie River had much more grasses.
Talking about the drought a couple of years ago and grass is coming back.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's a fascinating story. In the science world, our group and many other groups around the Bay have done lots of experiments where they were testing the idea that too much nitrogen and phosphorus in the water will negatively affect the seagrass growth. And you know what? That's correct. It does. But lab experiments are one thing. Real world experiments, particularly at the scale of whole ecosystems, are much rarer. And so that drought, which started in 1999 and persisted through 2002, was really insightful. So it was as if management suddenly was able to decrease the nutrient loads by a substantial amount. And we were able to see what the bay did. And one of the things the bay did was it grew seagrasses. And one of the outstanding examples was the giant seagrass bed on Susquehanna Flats, but there were a whole bunch of others. The Magathy was one of them. Seagrasses in the chop tank and other parts of the bay off of Pools Island, the big restoration site there. So what that did was, I think it gave all the people in the seagrass restoration world confidence that decreased nutrient loads are going to help seagrass growth in the bay. And one of the things that was really interesting was that there are apparently, at least in the freshwater parts of the bay, and maybe other parts as well, these quote unquote seed banks. And when conditions are good, these plants can get back rather rapidly in a few years.
That's great.
Not 10 or 15 decades. So a quick response, I think, is one of the things that we've learned gradually in the bay system, that the bay, in terms of water quality, and seagrasses, dead zones, is responsive, as opposed to having a very, very long memory where it would take a decade or two to purge some of these things out of the system so that we would start to see good news. Not true. We start to see good news pretty rapidly.
That's great.
Yes, it is.
That's great. As we continue to do more of these actions, that's
Yes.
good news for the bay.
Absolutely.
That's great. Lauren, you have another question? I think we've got a couple minutes left here as we're coming to the end.
Yeah, could you speak to the high cost and slow progress of watershed ecosystem restoration and how we might overcome the obvious obstacle?
So the challenge of the high cost of restoration and what can be slow progress.
Yeah. I'm not sure that there's any silver bullet here. One of the things that's impressed me is some of the actions Maryland has taken. For instance, and some people don't like this, but they had the flush tax, and the flush tax produced extremely good results. So that's one of the things that can move us forward. And we're also learning, I think, some of the best management practices that are the most efficient. And one of the ones that has come to the fore is the planting a no-till agriculture, planting grasses on these fields. So that's something that can move us ahead. It's interesting. Maryland is a bit of a leader, national leader in that effort compared to the Midwest, where you'd think in the grain belt, the corn belts, they would be way ahead of us. Actually, not true. We're ahead of them. So, we need to continue those kind of efforts. Another thing that people who are more politically astute than I am, which means almost anybody, said that political leadership is a key ingredient in moving things forward and accelerating progress. So that's something we all need to think about. And they point to administrations like Harry Hughes and O'Malley as times when Bay progress accelerated. And I don't mean to say that they're the only two, because they're not the only two. At local scales for decades, Bernie Fowler,
Absolutely.
at both the scale of the Patuxent and the whole Bay, provided that kind of enthusiastic, I think, insightful, science-based, practical leadership.
Yeah.
So, when we're all voting, we need to think about it. So those are some of my.
Yeah.
We're learning more, and we need political leadership.
the challenge, it is an expensive challenge, but we can't slow down the rate at which we're doing this work. We have to accelerate it out, actually. And, states like Pennsylvania, they're doing a lot, but they really continue to need to do more in this space. Agriculture, the runoff from agriculture, I think, is still the largest sector of pollutants in the Chesapeake Bay. So there's a lot of work to be done upstream on our farms. And at the same time, we were talking earlier about how more people are moving into the watershed. And so development, runoff from paved land is actually increasing. It's the one sector of pollution that's increasing in the Chesapeake Bay. So these are, I always think about how it took us generations, hundreds of years to get into this problem, and it's going to take us a while to get out of it. And as Walt just said, the Chesapeake Bay is responding positively. So I'm confident that if we keep up the good work, we keep our foot on the gas, that we can achieve great things. We can't slow down, and we have to continue to commit public resources and private resources to making this work happen.
Oh, well, that's one of the things the Alliance does well, is, gathers a lot of people at the table. And some of them are probably grumpy about it, but they're there. And that's one of the great parts of what you all do with the Alliance.
Yeah,
to
absolutely.
Get things done.
We need all 18 million people thinking about and doing their part for the Chesapeake Bay, for sure.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Well, this has been fun.
This has been fun. Laura, do you have any lingering questions before we wrap up here?
I'll just ask one last question. What is the target level of nitrogen in stream waters as we're measuring water quality? Is there something that that you should aim for when you're sampling? A level that you should aim for?
Target nitrogen levels in streams.
Yeah, no, that's a bit of a tough one, but I'll give you, again, some rules of thumb. We found some measurements in the Susquehanna River of nitrogen that were made by the USGS back in 1908, which was not long after chemists figured out how to measure nitrogen in the water. The answer was 0.35 milligrams per liter. Other guidance from EPA and those types of agencies is that concentrations ought to be somewhere less than 1, probably around 0.5, 0.7 milligrams per liter. Now, to put that in perspective, there are agricultural areas in California where the concentration of nitrate is 60 milligrams per liter. In some of our intensive agricultural areas, I've seen data that indicate it's 15 milligrams per liter. During the toughest parts of the nutrient problems in the Susquehanna, we would see concentrations as high as 3 and 4 milligrams per liter. So we need to keep pushing that down. Now we're seeing more measurements in the 1, 1.5, 2 range. We need to push that down below 1. So there's a range of concentrations that we've seen across the United States and in this basin. And so we're aiming for things that are well less than 1 milligram per liter.
That's great. All right. Anything else, Lauren, burning that we should answer before we wrap up here?
I think that sums up a lot of them.
All right, very good. Well, I want to thank Dr. Boynton for joining me on this beautiful but humid morning in Annapolis. I wish we could have shared the view with you all. We've been watching kids stand up paddleboard by us. We were sitting in front of the Wilma Lee, the only skipjack in Annapolis, one of 22 skipjacks left in the Chesapeake Bay. We've been watching some people fish and crab and really enjoy the resource here on Back Creek. So I want to thank everyone for joining us this morning. We've recorded this session. We will post it. We'll be sure to share it both on our YouTube channel and to our email subscribers. And I just wanted to let you know that in celebration of our 50th anniversary, our board of directors have raised a $25,000 match gift. So if you make a donation to the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay this summer, we will match that gift dollar for dollar up to $25,000. So I encourage you to consider making a gift so we can continue to keep the work up that the Alliance has been doing for the last 50 years. We have a lot more to do, and with your help, we know we can do it. So thanks, Walter, for joining me this morning. Thank you all for chiming in and joining us from wherever you are. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. Thanks so much.
Take care.